I'm Janine Gray. I am a physiotherapist, hence my interest in injury prevention. Also a researcher, and I have a special interest area of trying to prevent injury. Today's talk is going to talk specifically on preventing injury for sporting performance, because I think that is probably one of the key areas of interest for coaches. So we all know, working with players, that there's a cost to injury. It can be a financial cost that is borne either by the player, the team, or even the government when we look at injury costs. There's mental health issues that are really coming to the fore in injured athletes. Chronic health issues like OA are being researched a lot, and we understand that this to be a growing concern for the medical community. One that is close to my heart is attrition from sports participation, particularly in school kids following injury. But the one we're going to focus on today is performance. So the research will show you that a low injury rate is associated with high performance in teams. A successful team showed two criteria. One, there was greater player availability at all times, and there was lower injury rates. So it really should be a primary goal of all coaches to try and prevent injury. And I think this is a growing area of interest. This just shows you a coach actually fearing injuries far more than the coronavirus, certainly showing you the impact that injury had on what he would deem his team's performance. So we just need to look at the model of a sports injury. And I really just put this up, not that you understand every aspect of it, but I want you to understand the complexity of sports injury. We have a number of internal risk factors, things like age. We know older athletes are more predisposed for most injuries, although young players are more predisposed for stress fractures. So age can give you an inherent risk, and we call that the predisposed athlete. The athlete can then be exposed to certain external risk factors. So these can include human factors, like, for example, a reduced shoulder range of movement in a thrower. That creates a susceptible athlete. And then there has to be an inciting event. This could be workload, it could be training volume, high match scheduling, or actually a specific joint motion or a collision in rugby even. And that gives us an injury. My reason for doing this is to show you that there are a myriad of factors that can cause an injury, and very often it's an interaction of a number of these factors that will lead to an injury. So it's not a simple, injury prevention is not a simple matter. Just to take it a step further, if you looked at the human factors, or the human risk factors to injury, if we just looked at shoulder injuries in pitchers, and this isn't the exhaustive list of various biomechanical and musculoskeletal factors, there are a number of risk factors for pitchers with regards to increasing their load and causing injury. Now, very interestingly, I've done research in water polo players and cricketers, who obviously are also throwers. And what we found there is that the risk factors are different, and the musculoskeletal profile of the players is significantly different. So we cannot just take a preventative program from pitching and apply it to, for example, a group of water polo players. So it is a very complex issue. So that brings me to the question, what can a coach do? The first thing is to take accountability for injury. Now, I need to make it clear here, this isn't taking blame for the injury. This is taking accountability. Injury prevention is not the sole responsibility of a medical team. A number of you coaches might actually be working with schoolboy teams where there is no medical team. And so injury prevention will become your role, and you will have to drive it. But the second point you can always do, and you get so much insight from this, is knowing what injury your player has. So often I've heard coaches say, Peter's not available for this match because he's got an injury. You need to know what the injury is, so that by the time you are experiencing your fourth hamstring injury in your cricket team, you start to realize that this is a trend, and that you need to start putting some interventions into place, whether it is stretching, strengthening, or perhaps looking at the biomechanics a little bit more closely. The other thing is to know what tissue is injured. Is it a ligament? Is it a significant catastrophic injury? Are you having a lot of those? Or is it simple niggles and tweaks? And then the mechanism of injury for me and coaches is probably the most important. Understand exactly how the injury happened. Did it come on slowly? Could it be associated with workload? Have they just made a provincial team and has their workload increased, for instance? Or was it a particular movement that they did or a particular throw in water polo that caused the problem? Coaches are best suited to actually address the biomechanical issues. So if you understand the biomechanics that cause the injury, you know the area to look at when the player returns. The next thing is to actually engage in preventative strategies. So my first point here is you've got to ensure your athletes are adequately conditioned for the game and the season. And I think this is particularly important when we consider schoolboys and girls, and actually where there's not always a very good preseason, to make sure that they are appropriately conditioned. Strength and cardiovascular fitness is all as optimal as it can be to prevent injury. Monitoring workload is something that has received a lot of focus, both in research and the media. And I'm going to just cover a couple of issues around workload. What do we know about workload? Higher training loads have been associated with an increased injury risk. And a lot of this comes from medical professionals doing research in the area. But what is important to note, and this is very important for you as coaches, that an increased training load also improves performance. So now what is improving performance or has been associated with improved performance also carries an injury risk. But also the research will show you that undertraining increases the risk of injury. So we need to make sure that we find that sweet spot of load for our athletes. And you can only do this by knowing your individual players and what their individual workload is. Because we know that in a team of young schoolboys, for instance, some may be just training with you, some may be training with the provincial setup, in addition to maybe pre-season for the following season sport already. So we need to understand that. Higher chronic workloads have actually in more recent years been associated with a decreased injury risk. And this is something that I personally have been finding myself a lot of, whether I work with elite athletes or schoolboys, that very often, because we make this assumption that it's overload, there's just too much load and that's why they're getting injured. And I'm finding more and more sometimes it's actually that they actually don't have the strength or the fitness parameters to actually manage the load that is part of the game. So we need to look at that. The other point that is really important is that an injury-free preseason has been found in research to have a protective benefit against injury. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit more in a minute. So this just shows you the U-shaped curve that is associated with injury risk. We don't want too little or too much. And we need to make sure research has often, the pendulum will shift from one side to say, oh, too much load creates injury, and then it comes back to say too little. And in the middle is our sweet spot. Practical implications here is that perhaps, and this came out in a wonderful article by Tim Gabbett, who's done some really great research in this area, that maybe injury isn't caused by the training load so much itself, although in some cases excessive workload is associated with injury, but it could be more likely due to inadequate or inappropriate training programs. So some things that are valuable here is a rapid or excessive increase in training load should be avoided. A lack of pre-season in school children needs to be addressed. And I think one of the concerns about the increase in training load is things like Hell Week. Hell Week was something that the Navy SEALs used to do, or some Marines used to do. It was their 4th week of training, and they would be absolutely nailed with 5 hours of sleep a day and lots of activity. And this has been introduced into our school setups. The problem is that it's often in the week before school starts or the first week of school, and there is no pre-conditioning, so there's no level, adequate level of strengthening and cardiovascular fitness that's happened before. And so we find a lot of injury coming out of these kind of rapid increases in load. And then, please, athletes need to be sufficiently conditioned. And I really, as a physiotherapist, really important that our athletes are strong and fit enough for the game that they are playing. I'm not going to speak in this too much. Really what the main point around this was, research has shown that a Nordic hamstring intervention was actually significant in its reduction of injury in elite football players. But when they actually went to evaluate whether this program was being implemented, they found that clubs knew about it. They knew it was effective, but they hadn't implemented it. So we need to make sure that we have a collaboration between researchers and coaches, and we understand the reason that these programs weren't implemented. Is it that it required fancy equipment, or they didn't understand the reason for it? So we need to make sure that there's a lot more collaboration between researchers and medical professionals. The third thing is that coaches need to engage in recovery from injury. Once you've been injured, you have altered motor patterns. These can influence biomechanics. This influences the performance of your player. This is something that a coach needs to be involved with. There are often long-term strength deficits that would need particular training, particularly if you are in a coaching role where you don't have a lot of support staff, medical staff, or actually support staff. So please be aware of that. And then the other thing is the role of fear. And this is just some research that was done, and I'm going to interpret it for you, the graph on the right side. Basically what it showed was that as pain decreased, so the fear of pain, the fear of re-injury decreased. This was in ACL individuals, and I think one of the key take-home messages here was that at 3 years, they still had fear of re-injury. Therefore, a coach's dealing with this player returning to the team and addressing perhaps the mechanism of their injury, whether it's happened in a line-out, for instance, and actually being able to break the line-out down and slowly introduce them to the game is absolutely critical in reducing fear. So the final thing is, what can a coach do? Engage medical professionals and researchers to learn more about injury prevention. On the website, we have things like the FIFA 11 program, which has been found to be very successful. Different organizations like Cricket South Africa has Super 6 programs which are aimed to address common injuries. The third one is actually from a student of mine who did some research looking at water polo players, adolescent water polo players. So he designed an intervention based on his findings. And yeah, just keep an eye on the locker room. We're going to include information over the next few weeks on this too. But the take-home message from me is really engage in injury prevention, engage in your athletes that have been injured, whether it's in a small capacity as a school coach, just understanding your immediate environment, or being in a community of injury prevention specialists in more elite sports. Thank you very much.